Beneath the towering peaks of Grand Teton, a team of geologists trudged through a stretch of land no tourist ever wandered. The air was thin, crisp, and eerily quiet until one of them froze mid-step. Half buried in the damp soil was something pale, curved, and unmistakably human. At first they thought it might be an old animal bone, weathered by decades of harsh winters. But as the mud gave way under their gloves, the truth emerged: a human femur, cleanly snapped near the joint. There was no sign of a grave, no clothing, no clue as to how it had come to rest there. Just one bone, lying exposed under the shadow of the mountains. What began as a routine geological survey had suddenly become the opening line of a mystery stretching back more than 30 years, one that would tie the present to a haunting disappearance buried deep in the park's history. Thomas Winter was the sort of man people described as calm, capable, and quietly adventurous. At 32, he had spent most of his weekends outdoors, hiking across the American West with a small backpack, a camera, and a journal he never traveled without. In late August 2018, he set out alone for a 5-day trek through Grand Teton National Park, a route he'd planned meticulously from his entry point at Jenny Lake to his exit near Moran Junction. It was meant to be a break from his office job in Salt Lake City, a chance to breathe, to think, to reconnect with the wild. He'd done this sort of thing dozens of times before. He texted his sister the night before he set out, "Don't worry, I'll be back by Tuesday. Might lose signal for a few days." That text would be the last anyone ever heard from him. The first days passed quietly. No alarm was raised when he didn't check in. He was known for losing reception on hikes. But when Tuesday came and went, and there was still no sign of him, his sister contacted park rangers. What followed was one of the largest ground searches the Grand Teton authorities had carried out in years. Over 40 volunteers, search dogs, drones, and even a helicopter were dispatched to cover the dense terrain Thomas was known to have entered. At first they found what they always find in cases like this: the faint traces of routine. Boot prints in soft soil, a path carved by careful planning. Then, 3 days into the search, a ranger spotted something through the trees, a green tent, perfectly pitched, untouched by weather or wildlife. Inside were Thomas's sleeping bag, water filter, and a map folded neatly under a headlamp. Outside, a small camp stove sat on a rock, cold but still with gas inside. It was as if he'd stepped out for a moment and never come back. What was missing, however, was his backpack. It was the one thing he always carried, the one piece of equipment he never left behind. His camera, phone, and GPS tracker were inside it, and with them, any digital trace of what might have happened. Investigators checked the GPS signal last recorded from his device. It ended abruptly just 3 miles from his campsite, near a stretch of steep cliffs known for sudden weather shifts and loose footing. Search teams scoured the area for over a week. Drones combed the rocky slopes, divers searched the nearby lake, and dogs were brought in from Wyoming State Police. But there was nothing, not a shred of fabric, not a drop of blood, not even a broken branch. The weather remained dry throughout the search, so conditions were ideal. Yet it was as though Thomas had simply walked into the forest and vanished into thin air. Among the searchers, unease began to grow. Those familiar with wilderness disappearances knew the usual patterns: accidents, exposure, disorientation. But something about this case didn't fit. His campsite was too orderly, too deliberate. There were no signs of panic, no attempt at distress. If he'd fallen, his backpack should have been nearby. If he'd wandered, there should have been tracks. The silence of the place, the stillness of that perfect little camp, left everyone unsettled. As days turned into weeks, the official search was scaled down. Thomas's family continued on their own, posting flyers, setting up social media pages, and contacting anyone who might have seen him. A few hikers reported hearing shouting on the morning of August 23rd, somewhere near Taggart Lake, but when rangers investigated, the echoing terrain made it impossible to trace. Others mentioned seeing a lone man on a ridge that same day wearing a red jacket the same kind Thomas had packed. But no one could confirm it was him. By mid-September, the case was officially suspended. The park returned to its quiet rhythms: tourists, wildlife, the endless cycle of seasons. For most, the story faded another unfortunate accident in one of America's most unforgiving landscapes. But for those who'd been there, the scene lingered in their minds. That empty tent, perfectly intact, waiting for someone who would never come back, felt wrong. And years later, when a group of geologists stumbled across that bone protruding from the earth, barely 10 miles from where Thomas's last GPS signal had been recorded, the memory of that disappearance would come rushing back. Because the mountain, it seemed, had finally decided to return what it had kept hidden, but it would give back far more than anyone expected. It was nearly 4 years after Thomas Winter vanished when the mountains finally spoke again. A team of geologists, mapping erosion patterns near the western ridge of Grand Teton, were trudging through a patch of thawing soil after a mild spring rain when one of them noticed something unusual. At first glance, it looked like a length of bleached wood jutting from the ground. But as the light shifted and the mud gave way, they realized it wasn't wood at all. It was bone long, pale, and unmistakably human. The park rangers were called in, and the area was cordoned off within the hour. What began as a quiet geological survey quickly turned into a crime scene. The remains were partially buried, but remarkably preserved, protected by layers of silt and frost. The skull was intact, the jaw slightly ajar, as though frozen mid-breath. Beside it lay torn fabric and a scattering of rusted metal. One of the geologists swore they saw the glint of a zip pull, something small but oddly modern amid the decay. Forensic teams arrived from Jackson Hole the following morning. They worked slowly, carefully, documenting each fragment of evidence before removing it from the soil. It took days before the picture began to take shape: a skeleton, roughly adult male, likely there for several years. But one detail immediately caught their attention: a faded scrap of nylon, deep forest green, the same make as the tent found years earlier in Thomas Winter's campsite. The news broke quietly at first, through local channels. Then, once DNA confirmed the identity, the headlines came: "Remains of missing hiker found in Grand Teton after 4 years." For Thomas's family, it was the end of years of waiting, but it was also the beginning of something far stranger. When investigators combed the surrounding area for additional clues, they made 2 discoveries that refused to fit the timeline. The first was a piece of clothing, a tattered woman's jacket, partially buried a few feet from where the bones were found. It was distinctly old, the fabric thin, the label faded with time. Forensic analysts later dated the style to the mid-1980s. The second item was even more peculiar: a small brass key attached to a broken fob from a long-defunct motel in Idaho, nearly 100 miles away. At first, detectives assumed the items were random, perhaps dumped by another traveler or washed down from higher ground by melting snow. But when they cross-referenced the motel name with old missing persons reports, one particular file emerged: Susan Marshall, aged 29, last seen in 1987 while on a road trip through Wyoming and Idaho. She had checked into the very same motel the key belonged to. She had never been seen again. The link was almost too strange to be coincidence. Further tests on the fabric of the jacket revealed something impossible to ignore: traces of biological material still embedded in the lining. The sample was tiny, degraded by time, but enough for comparison. When the results came back, the lab confirmed it. A partial DNA match to Susan Marshall's records, preserved from an old dental sample kept by her family. For investigators, it was a revelation that changed everything. Thomas Winter's death was no longer an isolated tragedy. Somehow, his final resting place was entwined with a disappearance that had haunted the region for over 3 decades. In the days that followed, journalists descended on Jackson Hole, spinning theories that ranged from serial killers to mountain folklore. Some speculated that Thomas might have stumbled upon an old crime scene and that whoever had left it behind had ensured he never left alive. Others wondered if he'd found the jacket and key by chance, their presence a cruel accident of history. But the location remote, inaccessible, untouched, made those explanations hard to swallow. Thomas's family, while devastated by the confirmation of his death, found themselves dragged into a mystery they never asked for. Closure slipped further away with every new discovery. The park, once a place of beauty and peace, became a landscape of unanswered questions. For the detectives, though, the case had just been reborn. The past and the present were now intertwined, the decades between Susan's disappearance and Thomas's death collapsing into one chilling narrative. Someone, somewhere, had connected those two stories and left their evidence hidden beneath the same stretch of mountain soil. In the shadow of the Tetons, where wind whistled through endless pine, the truth had begun to surface. But what it revealed was not peace or justice, only a whisper from the past, cold and patient, waiting 30 years to be found. In the autumn of 1987, Susan Marshall vanished somewhere along the winding highways between Idaho and Wyoming. She was 29, bright, adventurous, and recently heartbroken after the end of a long relationship. Friends said the trip was meant to clear her head. She drove her old silver hatchback through the Rockies, sending postcards home to her sister every few days. The last one arrived postmarked from a small town outside Jackson, Wyoming. After that, nothing. For months, her family searched. Flyers were pinned to petrol stations, police checkpoints dotted the main roads, and volunteer groups combed through miles of forest. But no trace of Susan, her car, or her belongings was ever found. The case, lacking witnesses or evidence, eventually went cold. By the early 1992, her name was just another entry in a thick folder of unsolved disappearances across the American West. Decades later, when the DNA from Thomas Winter's discovery matched Susan's, detectives reopened the long-forgotten file. It was strange, almost cruel, two lives separated by 31 years, now intertwined by a single piece of decaying fabric. The Wyoming State Police formed a joint task force with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, determined to retrace Susan's final steps. They combed through old motel records, vehicle registration data, and outdated case notes handwritten in faded ink. One name soon began to surface repeatedly: Robert Peterson. Back in 1987, Peterson had been a 35-year-old geotechnical engineer working on a series of mining surveys across Wyoming and Colorado. He'd been interviewed briefly during the original investigation after witnesses at the motel remembered seeing him talking to Susan in the car park. At the time, he was described as helpful and polite, even offering to check her car's tires before she set off the next morning. Police never considered him a suspect. There was no evidence, and he'd moved out of state soon after. Now, with fresh technology and a new reason to look closer, Peterson's past began to unravel. Detectives located his daughter Emily, who still lived in Colorado. She was in her 40s and had no idea her father had ever been connected to a missing person case. He had died of heart failure in 2010, a respected engineer and family man by all accounts. When investigators approached her, Emily agreed to let them examine her late father's property, a modest house on the outskirts of Boulder, with a locked basement that had been untouched since his death. The search began quietly, almost reluctantly. But within hours, everything changed. Hidden behind a false wall in the basement was an old trunk. Inside were women's belongings: faded photographs, travel-sized toiletries, and a canvas handbag still bearing a cracked motel key tag from 1987. Tucked inside the bag was a small leather journal, its cover worn, its pages brittle with age. The handwriting was Susan's. The diary's final entries were fragmented but haunting. She wrote about meeting a man named Robert, a kind geologist who knew the area well and offered to show her a scenic shortcut through the Tetons. Her last line read simply, "He seems trustworthy." For investigators, the pieces were falling into place, but with every revelation came frustration. Peterson's death meant there would be no trial, no confession, no chance to confront him. The evidence was compelling. Susan's belongings hidden in his home, her DNA on the jacket found beside Thomas Winter's remains, and travel records confirming Peterson was working near the Grand Teton area in 1987. Yet, without a living suspect, the law could only declare what they believed to be true. As journalists dug deeper, more unsettling details emerged. Peterson had been known for solo hiking trips long after the 1,980 seconds, often in the same regions where Thomas Winter disappeared. His colleagues remembered his fascination with geology and remote terrain, but also his tendency to go off the grid for days at a time, returning evasive and withdrawn. To the public, the story took on an eerie, almost cinematic quality. A killer who lived an ordinary life, blending seamlessly into society. A man who raised a daughter, paid his taxes, and died peacefully, his secrets buried with him. It was a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always wear a monster's face. Sometimes it smiles politely, fixes your tires, and disappears into the crowd. For Emily, the truth was unbearable. She told reporters she felt as though she'd lost her father twice, once to death and once to the revelation of who he might have been. "He was just Dad," she said softly. "He taught me how to ride a bike. He made pancakes on Sundays. I never imagined." Her voice trailed off. By the time investigators closed the file again, the picture was as clear as it would ever be. Susan Marshall had likely been murdered in 1987 by Robert Peterson, whose actions had somehow ensnared Thomas Winter decades later. The two cases, separated by time, joined by tragedy, revealed not only the endurance of forensic science, but the unsettling truth that some stories never really end. They simply wait, buried under layers of silence, until the past decides to surface once more. In the end, investigators pieced together what they could only call the final theory. Robert Peterson, the quiet engineer, the friendly face in the motel car park, was almost certainly responsible for both disappearances. The evidence was there, scattered across decades. Susan's DNA, her diary, the belongings hidden in his basement, and his presence in Grand Teton at the time Thomas Winter vanished. It formed a chilling pattern, one that spoke not of coincidence but of something far darker. Yet, as with so many cold cases, justice arrived too late. Peterson had died peacefully in his sleep, never questioned, never charged. Whatever truth he carried went with him. For Thomas's family, the discovery brought no comfort, only a new layer of grief. Their son, once a mystery, was now part of a tragedy much larger than they'd ever imagined. And for Susan's loved ones, the confirmation was both a blessing and a curse. After 30 years of silence, they finally knew, but the knowledge came without accountability. In the shadow of the mountains where both lives ended, there's a quietness that feels almost sacred. Hikers pass through unaware, the wind moving through the pines as if whispering fragments of their stories. Two people, bound by fate, by place, and by the silence of a man who could no longer answer for what he'd done. Perhaps that's what makes this case linger, not just the horror of the crime, but the unfinished humanity of it. Because in the end, some truths don't set us free. They simply remind us how fragile we are and how much remains buried beneath the surface of ordinary lives. If stories like this make you stop and think about justice, fate, and the darkness that hides in plain sight, remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and share your thoughts below. Every story here uncovers a piece of truth that time tried to forget, and there are many more waiting to be told.